that Sam and in Malaysia and Walhi in Indonesia are releasing today. The report has, as Bart said, looked at carbon market laws in the global south that are currently being developed and put in place, and how these are set to increase corporate control over community lands in a very worrying way. Under our radar, I would think. So I'm very glad that Milieu Defensie undertook to take a look at these legislations with the four organizations named. I will start with sharing some general observations that I think hold true across the four in-depth country investigations or across the four research papers on the specifics of the countries. One observation and one common trend that we see is that corporations with a very long track record of forest destruction and of violating community rights stand to profit in all the four countries, as far as we can see, or at least in Colombia, Indonesia, and Malaysia, from the carbon market laws that are being put in place. The legislative process in Liberia has for years been driven, much more so than in any of the other countries, by foreign agencies' carbon trading agendas, and not by the needs of forest-dependent communities. In all four of the countries, the carbon market laws also risk undermining the very hard-won advances in the recognition of forest people's rights, and also the very hard-won advances on communities to have control over their customary lands. We also see, when we look at the legislation underway and the first examples of what that legislation translates into when it comes to projects and activities on the ground, we see some worrying patterns being repeated from the unregulated so-called voluntary carbon market. It's conservation groups and conservation businesses, and now particularly in Colombia, Indonesia, Malaysia, also logging and plantation companies and the mining industry that will benefit from these scaled up regulated carbon markets at national levels that are being enabled by the carbon market and climate laws in those four countries. We also see the pattern repeated from the unregulated carbon market that communities risk facing empty promises that there will be a fair share of benefits for them. But instead of a fair share of benefits, what they will get is a substantial loss of autonomy over their territories and restrictions imposed on them on how they can actually use the land under their control or the land that they depend on. When I will, in the remainder of the time, I will focus on some key findings from Malaysia and Indonesia, because the following speakers from SDI and Sensat will delve in detail into the findings in Liberia and in Colombia. So in Malaysia, it's quite a complicated situation, because the constitutional mandate for legislation that relates to forests and lands is divided in quite a complicated way between state governments and the federal government of Malaysia. And there's currently still quite some debate over the extent of the mandate of the federal government to actually pass carbon market law that will then affect land over which the states have jurisdiction. That's particularly an issue in relation to the legislation as it will pertain to Sarawak and Sabah. Those two states, or those two state governments, they have a larger amount of, or a larger remit of autonomy over land and forest legislation than the other Malaysian states. When we look at what this carbon market regulations and laws underway in Malaysia mean for forest people's rights, indigenous people's rights, we see on the one hand that the courts since the 1990s have continuously ruled in Malaysia that the state has a fiduciary duty to protect the rights and welfare of indigenous peoples. But as in other cases around the concession, handing out of concessions for logging, we also see with the carbon market legislation that that fiduciary duty to protect the rights and welfare of indigenous peoples is falling by the wayside in the carbon market legislation that's being developed. The implications, the consequences for indigenous peoples' territories in Malaysia, quite likely and quite worryingly, is that forest carbon offsetting concessions or project areas, activity areas, as they will be called, will be handed out. And like other licensed activities or like other concession activities, and be declared to be free or largely free from indigenous customary rights, even though that's in reality not the case. So there is, it's already foreseeable that those new laws will increase the violation of indigenous people's rights in Malaysia and increase the potential and real conflict because indigenous people's rights, their territorial rights, will be ignored in the issuance of concessions or licenses to pursue carbon activities in Malaysia. I will share 2 slides from the presentations this morning that were shared by our colleague from SAM in Malaysia, Friends of the Earth Malaysia, which show in this one that while at the federal level, there hasn't been much legal change. It's still a lot of discussion, and the climate change bill is still being under government review. Nothing has been published. By contrast, the 2 big forest states with the largest level of autonomy also over land and forest legislation, Sarawak and Sabah, have advanced quite quickly with some key legal changes. In Sarawak, already the Forest Ordinance of 2015 has been amended with the Ordinance 2022, and that ordinance has introduced forest carbon as an activity that can be taken place in already issued concessions. Concession holders, in other words, with that legal change in Ordinance 2022, are able to use their existing concessions to also carry out forest carbon, forest offsetting activities. Similarly, in Sabah, activities that allegedly reduce deforestation from deforestation and forest degradation have been declared an area that can be undertaken in forest concessions. What does that mean? In more detail, when we look at the Sarawak Forest Ordinance 2015 and the amendment of 2022, we see that very explicitly the carbon law or the change has introduced carbon as an activity, as I said, that can be undertaken in existing concessions. And forest carbon activity is defined in the law as any activity, any action, any project, or any group of activities that lead to emission reductions, which then have to be verified with a carbon standard and can then be used either on a domestic carbon market or sold on an international carbon market. When we fast forward and look at what those changes mean, we find that we found a forest carbon, an offset project, the Marudi Carbon Project, run by one of Malaysia's most notorious logging companies, or its subsidiary, Sam Ling. And here we have a situation where the carbon rights holder or the user of those new carbon rights enshrined in the forest ordinance, and the proponent of this of the Marudi carbon project is also the concession holder of a large monoculture plantation concession. And the carbon project is actually taking part within that monoculture plantation concession that Sam Ling has been holding for a long time. And now is on a portion of the concession carrying out a carbon project. I think a very clear example of where legal changes to set in place forest carbon markets in Malaysia and particularly in Sarawak are headed to facilitate the existing forest and plantation license holders to use the existing licenses and new licenses to benefit from the carbon market. Like elsewhere, I would already like to interject here that what we have seen also across the countries, that the legal changes, they're not driven by a concern for climate and the climate crisis. They are driven by an interest of cashing in on a new business opportunity that is arising from the carbon market, from turning a climate crisis actually into a business opportunity. In Sabah, the second Malaysian state with large autonomy over its forest and land laws, we see a development very similar to what we saw in Liberia, in that the government rushed into a very controversial agreement, in this case with a company called Hoogstandard, to give away over 2 million hectares of forests in Sabah for in a contract that would have spanned 100 years. Like in the case of Liberia, there was very little to no public discussion, let alone recognition of the indigenous people's rights. And what we have seen in Sabah is that civil society in the country, in Malaysia, has taken action, and there are civil legal actions being filed by an indigenous community against challenging the legality of this agreement in Sabah. When we now move to Indonesia and look at the new laws underway in Indonesia, we see a similar development in that much of the legal changes are geared towards making it easier for existing license holders, logging and plantation companies in particular, to also use the licenses that they already have to turn these into carbon credit generating activities. One piece of legislation that helps that is the Job Creation Act, which introduced what is called a multi-purpose concession. So instead of having to apply to apply for either a logging concession or a plantation concession, a company can apply for or turn its existing concession into a multi-purpose concession, and it could then, on one part of the concession, continue logging or set up a eucalyptus plantation, and the other part of the concession it uses to run a carbon offset project. So the carbon market legislation enables concession holders to cash in on the carbon market, and as it was in Colombia, we see a lot of parallels actually between the development in Indonesia and experience already in Colombia with carbon markets domestically. In Indonesia also, while on the one hand, the legislation enables concession holders to cash in on the carbon market, the legislation lacks clear reference that would be able or would secure the recognition of indigenous people's rights or traditional community rights. One example, the Ministry of Environment and Forestry, one of the key regulations or pieces of legislation is Regulation 7/2023 on the forest sector carbon trading procedures. It's, as I said, a key piece of regulation that sets up the carbon market in forest areas. It doesn't say anything about the need for free, prior, informed consent. And it also has no procedures that would guarantee the rights of forest peoples. A very dangerous situation indeed, if on the one hand, more land is opened up for forest carbon activities and the procedures to use that land for carbon trading activities says nothing about protecting forest people's rights. What the legislation, and this is coming to an end with an example from also this morning's webinar, where our colleague from Indonesia shared an investigation by a journalist platform called Tempo. Unlike in Colombia, where at least there is comparatively, I would say, quite some information made available also from the government agencies tasked with monitoring the national carbon market. There is next to no information on what concessions are open to generate carbon credits, which credits are used, which companies are interested so far in Indonesia. And the legislation also is very vague on the information that will be made public. So a big risk that sharing information will mean finding journalists with the capacity and the resources to dig up the detailed and necessary information to be able to follow how exactly these carbon markets, the carbon market in Indonesia, will affect forest communities. The information shared from this Tempo investigation, information from the Tempo investigation that was shared this morning was that since this job creation law and the possibility to use one concession for multiple purposes was introduced, over 152 entities have applied for additional licenses that can be used for multi-purpose. And many of those overlap indigenous peoples and forest community land. So conflicts are already programmed into the issuance of those new multi-purpose concessions. I will end with another big parallel that we see between various countries that were covered in the research that that Milieudefensie and SAM, SDI, Wali, and Sinsat are publishing today, and that is that Colombian standard provider carbono increasingly is working and signing agreements with either state entities or institutions in Malaysia and or Indonesia to cooperate on setting up the carbon markets in Indonesia and Malaysia. The first headline was from this week. Colombian Standard teams up with Malaysian state to boost carbon biodiversity market and infrastructure. So carbono has signed a memorandum of understanding with one of the Malaysian states, aiming at speeding up the development of forest carbon markets in the state. And just a few weeks earlier, there was an article about the carbon market legislation being developed in Indonesia, where also the reference was to carbono, the Colombia-based standard, which plays a key role in the Colombian forest carbon market, being on its way to Indonesia to also explore what they call cooperation to speed up carbon markets. So to sum up, I go back to the beginning, where we must say, unfortunately, the new laws underway are set to facilitate a significant corporate land grab, as all land grabs, at the cost of forest communities, and at the end of the day also at the cost of the climate, because none of this is driven as far as I could see in compiling the research from those 4 countries. None of this is driven by a concern for slowing climate chaos, but all of it is driven by an interest in cashing in on a carbon market profiteering from a climate crisis. I'm very grateful for Milieudefensie and the four organizations that collaborated to start putting and documenting, generating evidence of what we're witnessing. With that, I hand back to Bart and say thank you.
Thank you, Jutta, for that that presentation. That gives a good overview of some of these worrying trends that we're seeing, and shares some background on what's happening in Indonesia and Malaysia. We will now look more closely at the cases of Colombia and Liberia. We'll start with Jonathan Ja from SDI in Liberia. Jonathan, if you're ready, you can start your screen and then start your presentation. Jonathan, are you ready to present? Yes, it's loading. You are muted, Jonathan. Jonathan, sorry, can you unmute yourself before you start?
Thank you. Sorry,
yeah, that works. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah,
go ahead.
It's fine. Okay, so I'm Jonathan here from the Sustainable Development Institute. I work on our forest governance program. So I will highlight some of the things contained in the report. That's not a detail, and you will read the details in the report itself. And also my experience with the carbon or climate change legal drafting process will be included. I will speak briefly on our climate pledge, our commitment, and then what is happening about our carbon law or national climate change policy and law, and also those are the key actors that are involved with the carbon process in Liberia. Oh, what's happening? My screen stopped. Okay. So our NDC, we pledge to reduce greenhouse gas by 64% by 2030. And out of that, the government of Liberia will unconditionally reduce 10% of that. And then the remaining 54%, we are supposed to source that from the from international support. Within that framework, we hope to reduce deforestation. We go to Jacob. Sorry for the brief interruption. To reduce deforestation by 50%, and then forest conversion by 40%, and forest restoration by 25%. I put these two photos side by side here of the alarming situation that is happening in Southeast Liberia, including Nima County, Grangida, Riojida, the main counties that these are happening, where they know that our forest is divided into two main blocks, the Western and the Southeastern block. So the Southeastern block is currently being disturbed. The photo on the left are migrants from Ivory Coast, mostly Ivorians and Burkinabes. They are assembled to register, and the one on the right is the forest that is being cleared for cocoa. So it's a very alarming situation, and how will we be able to address this by 2030 is some situation for concern. I just wanted to highlight that. For our legal process, we currently do not have a overarching policy or law. Develop a policy and law, and we, civil society and the government and our partners, work together to separate the process, the policy process, from the legal drafting process. And so currently the policy formulation is ongoing, even though not much has been heard in the public. I have some little bit of evolution here. Back in 2007, our first big carbon concession was UK-based carbon harvesting concession that wanted access to 400,000 hectares. But the process of acquiring it went into some situation, and so that thankfully that concession process did not go through. Also, in 2009 and 2010, thereabout, two concessions, agricultural concessions, one over more than 200,000 hectares and the other one over 300,000 hectares, Golden Verulam and Sam Darby in the western region, and then Golden Verulam in the Sino in the southeastern region. Golden Verulam has been able to clear more land because it used the COVID time to be able to clear community land. Sam Darby got frustrated and they left the country to show their interest because the area they tried to acquire, they were all community-owned land, so they could not, access those lands. But they still have the concession. They still have the rights to the carbon. Exclusive rights over the carbon. Also, the RED Plus process has also been ongoing for some time. The National Climate Change Secretariat was established under the Ellen's government. And then it was first in the president's office, is now within the Environmental Protection Agency. Also, a big thing climate change and was supporting the RED process was the Norway-Liberia deal, which was a $150 million deal. But out of that, and the main thing that it sought to address was deforestation and forest degradation that will lead to a result-based payment by 2018. That has not happened. Only 37.5 million of that money was actually turned into project, the Liberia Forest Sector project. We also have this situation in 2023 where Blue Carbon tried to access more than 1 million hectares of forest, whereas we have just had our Land Rights Act that communities' customary rights were protected. And so one of the main problems of this Blue Carbon deal was a completely ignore community customary rights. Of course, we have started, as I mentioned earlier, with developing we were first saying carbon law is now called National Climate Change Policy and Law. And the policy process is separated from the legal drafting, which I will say a little bit about the policy process. So the policy formulation is ongoing. Consultant have been hired. There's a first inception report that has been released to a technical committee. But everything that is in is like the outline of the policy, which is in the inception report. It talks mostly about Article 6.2 and Article 6.4. And then it emphasized that the product of the policy will be a stakeholder-informed final carbon policy document. Currently, the public has not been engaged mostly yet. And another thing is that the government has not committed funding to this process, and so it is moving slowly. This was supposed, the roadmap states that the whole process would have lasted a year. We are now going to the middle of the year, and the policy formulation is still ongoing. In the inception report, in passing, they mentioned about the policy will also address a non-market-based approach on Article 6.8, and that's all that exists in the outline in the inception report. So if much will be committed to the non-market approach, I doubt it at this particular moment because everything is geared towards the carbon market. The Fauna and Flora International, which is now Fauna and Flora, is piloting a carbon project and is supposed to inform this policy and legal drafting process. Also, there's an engagement with Coalition for Rainforest Nation to assist with some technical support in this process. Yeah, how that is aligned with the policy formulation is something to explore. Okay, so I'll close with the main actors, the external actors that are supporting our legal drafting process. UNDP has been one of the main organizations that have been driving the carbon market for Liberia to go through a legal or formulation of a law. They currently they supported the roadmap for the carbon policy and the law. They did initial work to support the roadmap development. They're currently supporting the process also. They have a project, Let Go Green, which the focus is the carbon market. They piloting in several areas, several communities in Liberia. One of those I know is in Bapulu, in one of the community forests. Our team recently visited the community, and the community is having an issue that they did not agree to have this Lego Green project, and the community is still wanting to carry a logging concession in that community. So that is another thing. I mentioned earlier about the Rare Plus, the only project of the Norway Liberia letter of intent that has been the $32.5 million support, which led to the development of the FREL, Forest Reference Emission Level, that was submitted to the Climate Change Secretariat. They also did some work on the development of regulatory framework for RARE. We have the RARE Plus strategy. According to this policy and legal development, there will be further review once the policy and law are completed. NovaSphere has been helping, have been supporting, providing consultancy role for as long as I know, and it's still also supporting this process. Like I mentioned about Fauna and Flora, they are supporting the FDA in this carbon framework development. Also, the World Bank has been working in Liberia supporting the Norway money was passing through the World Bank, and their main purpose is to focus on reducing emission in the Upper Guinea Forest region. These are the main players in our carbon development. So to highlight these. Thank you very much. how do I leave? Okay, stop sharing. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you very much. That gives a really clear overview of what's happening in Liberia. And then we'll continue with Joanna Peña from Censad Agua Viva in Colombia. Joanna is a forest expert with Censad Agua Viva, and she will tell us more about the recent developments in Colombia. Joanna, the floor is yours.
Gracias, muchas gracias. Listo. Muy buenos días para todos, todas y todes. Mi nombre es Joana, como ya lo han mencionado. Yo formo parte del área de selvas y biodiversidad de Censada Agua Viva, de Amigos de la Tierra Internacional, una organización que se circunscribe en los ambientalismos populares y que ha trabajado pues por 35 años en el cuidado del agua, los territorios y la vida. Para el caso particular, yo tuve la oportunidad de llevar a cabo esta investigación sobre los cambios legislativos y regulatorios que facilitan e impulsan el mercado de carbono en Colombia. Y parte de esa investigación, pues, es lo que ustedes ven plasmado en este texto y que se resume en este título, leyes que premian a los contaminadores y territorios que pagan el precio. Entonces, ¿de qué vamos a hablar? Bueno, primero de los cambios normativos en el mercado de carbono en Colombia, diferenciando el mercado de carbono regulado del voluntario. Vamos a ver un poco quiénes son los actores que mueven el mercado de carbono en Colombia y, por último, algunos impactos ambientales que estos proyectos están generando. Bueno, para comprender los cambios legislativos, regulatorios y políticos que se han hecho en Colombia sobre el mercado de carbono, tanto voluntario como regulado, es necesario tener en cuenta que las metas establecidas por Colombia en las contribuciones nacionales determinadas, o NDCs, fueron actualizadas en el año 2020 y fueron acogidas por la Ley 2169 de 2021. Allí se estableció básicamente que Colombia debe reducir el 51% de sus emisiones de gases de efecto invernadero al año 2030, equivalente a 169.44 millones de toneladas de CO2 equivalente, y acercarse a la carbono neutralidad en el año 2050. Pero digamos que las acciones para dar cumplimiento a estas metas están principalmente asociadas con procesos legislativos, regulatorios y políticos que facilitan el mercado de carbono. Entonces, con relación al mercado de carbono regulado en Colombia, se ha generado una serie de regulaciones que lo impulsan. Primero, en el año 2016, mediante la ley 1819, se generó el Impuesto Nacional al Carbono. Este se constituyó en el primer instrumento económico y financiero que le puso precio al carbono en el país y aplica a todas las empresas que usan combustibles líquidos y carbón, pero desde el año 2025. Sin embargo, desde el año 2017 se generó un beneficio tributario que se llama el mecanismo de no causación del Impuesto Nacional al Carbono, con el cual las empresas contaminadoras podían evadir el 100% del impuesto al carbono. Este beneficio fue el que generó, de hecho, que los proyectos RED+ tuvieran un crecimiento del 42% anual. Posteriormente, con la reforma tributaria del actual gobierno, ese beneficio tributario se redujo al 50%. Sin embargo, esta restricción no ha evitado que estos proyectos, pues obviamente, sigan aumentando en el país. Dentro del mercado de carbono regulado también tenemos dos mecanismos que están siendo fuertemente impulsados por el Estado. Por un lado está el sistema de comercio de emisiones, que en Colombia se llama Programa Nacional de Cupos Transables de Emisión de Gases de Efecto Invernadero, en el cual el gobierno establecerá unos límites de emisión por sector y otorgará unos cupos transables de emisión a las industrias para respaldar sus emisiones de gases de efecto invernadero. Se prevé que este sistema empiece a funcionar a partir del año 2026 con una fase piloto. Y es importante mencionar que su estructuración se está llevando a cabo de la mano con el Banco Mundial, específicamente con la Asociación para la Preparación del Mercado de Carbono, o PMR, por sus siglas en inglés. Y por otro lado está el artículo 6 del Acuerdo de París, el cual no ha sido reglamentado, pero sí hemos visto que a partir de la actualización de la NDC en el año 2020, el Estado quiere utilizar los resultados de mitigación transferidos internacionalmente o los ITMO para alcanzar su meta de reducir a cero la deforestación neta pues de bosques naturales para el año 2030. Esto indica que, además de fomentar el cumplimiento del artículo 6.2 del Acuerdo de París, Colombia cambió su meta de reducción de deforestación bruta cero, en donde se medía únicamente la pérdida de los bosques, a deforestación neta cero, donde se restará el aumento de la cobertura forestal a la deforestación bruta, ¿no? Y también es importante señalar que el país firmó un memorando de entendimiento entre el gobierno de Colombia y el Ministerio de Comercio e Industria de la República de Singapur en el año 2022. Y su finalidad es generar procesos de cooperación con el artículo 6 del Acuerdo de París, ¿no? Este memorando vincularía cuestiones asociadas con intercambio de experiencias, información sobre los créditos de carbono, incluyendo la negociación de un acuerdo de implementación jurídicamente vinculante que establezca un marco bilateral para la autorización y transferencia de resultados de mitigación transferidos internacionalmente, o los ITMOS, como ya se mencionaron. Perdón, con relación al mercado de carbono voluntario, como les mencioné, desde el mecanismo de no causación, se le ha dado un fuerte impulso al mercado voluntario y por este motivo también se han generado diferentes cambios normativos que pretenden regular este mecanismo. Por un lado está el Registro Nacional de Reducción de Emisiones de Gases de Efecto Invernadero, RENARE, que básicamente funciona como un repositorio de información sobre los programas y proyectos que pretenden la mitigación de gases de efecto invernadero, el cual ha sido bastante insuficiente, pues muchos de los proyectos no se encuentran registrados y además la información que consignan allí las empresas no es verificada por parte de la autoridad ambiental. También se generó un Sistema Nacional de Salvaguardas en el año 2017 que supuestamente pretende prevenir las afectaciones sobre los derechos fundamentales de las comunidades locales y la integridad de los ecosistemas. Sin embargo, desde su nacimiento, este Sistema Nacional de Salvaguardas ha tenido un carácter orientador y no vinculante, y por lo mismo las empresas tuvieron una amplia flexibilidad para su implementación. En el 2017 se empezaron a generar también varios mecanismos para impulsar el mercado de carbono voluntario en Colombia. Algunos de estos son la plataforma de mercado voluntario de carbono que lanzó la Bolsa Mercantil de Colombia para la comercialización de certificados de carbono. En ese mismo año se firmó la Declaración de Cali en el marco de la Alianza del Pacífico con países como Colombia, Chile, México y Perú. En esta declaración se mencionó la importancia de establecer mecanismos de mercado voluntario para promover el crecimiento verde y la acción climática. Y también en ese mismo año se generó la coalición de liderazgo para la fijación de precios del carbono del Banco Mundial en Colombia, donde el país reafirmó su compromiso con la implementación de estos mecanismos. Y pues en la cumbre One Planet que se llevó a cabo en París, Colombia, en conjunto con otros países, anunciaron planes para una plataforma de comercio que vincularía los mercados de carbono en las Américas. Luego, en el 2018, surgió la resolución 1447 de 2018, que estableció los requisitos mínimos para la formulación y revisión de las iniciativas de mitigación de emisiones de gases de efecto invernadero. Esta es una resolución que está en proceso de actualización por parte del Ministerio de Ambiente y Desarrollo Sostenible y en el mismo año, 2018, el Ministerio generó la resolución 256 de 2018 en la cual se estableció que las compensaciones asociadas a los licenciamientos ambientales podrán optar a pagos por resultados o compensaciones similares una vez que cumplan con los requisitos legales pues correspondientes. Asimismo, el gobierno le ha dado un fuerte impulso al crecimiento del mercado de carbono en Colombia mediante estrategias de financiamiento. Una es mediante la Guía de Buenas Prácticas para la Emisión de Bonos Verdes, que es de la Superintendencia Financiera de Colombia, que consiste en la emisión de instrumentos de deuda por entidades públicas o privadas para financiar proyectos con beneficios ambientales. Allí se prioriza el desarrollo y acciones relacionadas con la conservación de la biodiversidad, acciones de deforestación, aforestación y restauración, y también está la taxonomía verde, en donde el Ministerio de Hacienda y Crédito Público y la Superintendencia Financiera de Colombia, perdón, pretenden la movilización de recursos económicos para proyectos de carbono, proyectos Red Más, pagos por servicios ambientales y bancos de hábitat inclusive. Eh, el Gobierno Nacional también ha venido trabajando perdón, en la definición de la naturaleza jurídica de los créditos de carbono y los cupos transables de emisión. Los avances de estas discusiones en realidad se desconocen al momento. Y por último, es importante mencionar que en el año 2024 la Corte Constitucional de Colombia expidió la sentencia T-248, mediante la cual se suspendió por 6 meses un proyecto Red Más por violar los derechos de la comunidad indígena del Pirá, Paraná, y ordenó al Ministerio de Ambiente fortalecer la regulación del mercado. Entonces, con todo esto es importante destacar que quienes mueven el mercado de carbono en Colombia son pues estas organizaciones, ¿no? Además de las institucionales que ya mencioné, pero que tienen un poder muy importante para modificar pues las normativas relacionadas con este tema. Por un lado están las asociaciones privadas, como Carbono, que constantemente genera propuestas para modificar la normatividad relacionada con el mercado de carbono. De hecho, ellos han propuesto al ministerio financiar la operación del RENARE, han propuesto reformas para que se cambie el criterio de adicionalidad y se permita la ejecución de proyectos Red Más en áreas protegidas. También se han posicionado fuertemente frente a la reducción del porcentaje del mecanismo de no causación, diciendo que la reducción de la deforestación sería mayor si se elimina ese techo del 50%. Están involucrados también en la modificación de la resolución 1447-2018. Y bueno, han dicho de manera clara que los proyectos Red Más no requieren ni de consulta previa ni de consentimiento previo libre e informado, porque no genera una afectación directa e intensa a las comunidades. Y además porque dicen que supuestamente nacen como propuestas de las mismas comunidades. Y bueno, ya vamos a ver por qué esto es totalmente debatible. Aquí también está Fede Maderas, que en conjunto con Conservación Internacional Colombia y Ecoversa, dicen que la ampliación de plantaciones forestales comerciales en Colombia es fundamental para la ampliación del mercado de carbón. También están los bancos multilaterales, en este caso pues el Banco Mundial ha tenido un papel fundamental, una fuerte influencia en la consolidación de esta reglamentación del mercado de carbono en Colombia. Por un lado, el país ha trabajado en la coalición de liderazgo para la fijación de precios al carbono, al que se unió en el 2017, y también ha realizado consultorías para el Ministerio de Ambiente y ha generado recomendaciones para mejorar el mecanismo de no causación y la destinación del recaudo del Impuesto Nacional al Carbono. Está participando en este momento en la consolidación del Programa Nacional de Cupos Transables de Emisión. Y también está trabajando con el gobierno para generar el sistema de información de salvaguardas que se espera esté articulado con el RENARE. Frente a las grandes ONGs conservacionistas, pues bueno, estas han participado en diferentes procesos normativos. Por ejemplo, WWF apoyó el surgimiento del Sistema Nacional de Salvaguardas en el año 2017, y The Nature Conservancy también ha participado en diferentes proyectos Red Más en Colombia. Las empresas relacionadas con proyectos específicos, pues aquí tenemos 2 empresas específicas, pero en realidad son un montón de empresas desarrolladoras, certificadoras, organismos de verificación y validación, intermediarios financieros, entre otros, que también influyen fuertemente en los cambios normativos del mercado de carbón. Y pues obviamente las empresas contaminantes son las empresas que adquieren estos créditos de carbono en el mercado voluntario, para neutralizar, ¿no?, sus emisiones. Y pues así acceder al beneficio tributario, perdón, del Impuesto Nacional al Carbono. Pues aquí vemos a Chevron, Prodeco, Terpel, hay muchísimas más. Y bueno, aquí quería mostrarles la Interpretación Nacional de Salvaguardas Sociales y Ambientales de Colombia, que toma estas 7 salvaguardas de Cancún y las transforma en estos 15 principios que vemos acá. Esta Interpretación Nacional de Salvaguardas Sociales y Ambientales, pues digamos que ya se ha violado de diferentes maneras, porque como les dije previamente, no es vinculante en el país. Al día de hoy las empresas pueden implementarla o no, si no quieren. Entonces aquí les traje como 2 ejemplos que son muy dicientes en el caso de Colombia. El primero es el proyecto Red Más Vaca Rocarire, que está siendo desarrollado. Bueno, digamos que es el que generó justamente la sentencia 248 de 2024. Y este proyecto, digamos que esa sentencia más bien evidenció justamente que había una violación de los derechos fundamentales y colectivos de las comunidades indígenas del río Pirá-Paraná. Lo que ha pasado aquí es una constante violación justamente de estas salvaguardas sociales y ambientales, ¿no? Por un lado, vemos que el Consejo Indígena del Río Pirá-Paraná no tuvo conocimiento de la suscripción del proyecto, entonces pues hay obviamente un tema complejo en términos de transparencia y acceso a la información. También que el desarrollador no llevó a cabo un proceso de consentimiento con las comunidades que se enteraron posterior a la firma del contrato. Entonces no ha habido una consulta previa, ni un consentimiento previo libre informado, ni una participación real y efectiva. Perdón, de nuevo. El desarrollador generó compromisos con 78 comunidades del Pirá Paraná para reducir el 30% de sus chagras. El desarrollador de este caso es esta empresa que se llama Más Bosques. Y pues esto es bastante complejo porque aquí también hay un tema de soberanía alimentaria que se está poniendo en riesgo, ¿no? Entonces se está poniendo también de por medio el tema del conocimiento, los conocimientos tradicionales y obviamente los derechos territoriales. Pues bueno, como ya les mencioné también, está la sentencia de la Corte Constitucional que dice que se firmó un contrato de mandato con un representante legal sin reconocer los usos y costumbres de la comunidad. Y también tenemos otro caso, digamos que aquí les traje solo 2, pero pues en realidad en Colombia, como Sensata Agua Viva, hemos logrado rastrear por lo menos unos 10 proyectos con este tipo de complejidades, aunque sabemos que hay muchos más porque no tenemos tampoco la capacidad. Pero en este caso, el proyecto de conservación Tángara Red Más, lo que ha sucedido es que desde el año 2019 la empresa Tángara Forest ha afirmado que el territorio que abarca 2 consejos comunitarios, que son Mallorquín, Raposo y también Achincayá, son privados, ¿no? Y que ha presentado certificados de falsa tradición para afirmarlo. Esto es muy grave porque estos consejos comunitarios, que son de comunidades afrodescendientes, tienen estos títulos de propiedad sobre estos terrenos desde el año 1999. Entonces, obviamente aquí hay una violación de los derechos territoriales, pues bastante grave. También lo que ha pasado es que la empresa igual sigue diciendo que el territorio es de ellos y han implementado el proyecto Red Más sobre el territorio, independientemente del proceso que está en curso en la Agencia Nacional de Tierras, ¿no? Entonces, obviamente, la comunidad no ha recibido los recursos económicos provenientes de la venta de más o menos 1 millón de bonos de carbono a diciembre del 2024. Entonces, obviamente, no hay una rendición de cuentas y claramente tampoco hay una distribución equitativa de los beneficios. Según lo reportado por la empresa, el Ministerio del Interior les dijo que en el territorio no habitaban comunidades afrodescendientes y por lo mismo pues no se hizo ni la consulta previa y menos el consentimiento previo libre e informado. Entonces esto también es bastante complejo porque el mismo Ministerio del Interior generó un certificado en donde dice que en ese territorio no existen comunidades afrodescendientes, pero como les mencioné previamente, esta es una comunidad afrodescendiente que tiene este territorio, tiene la titulación colectiva de ese territorio desde el año 1999. Entonces también es otro proceso que está en curso y que, bueno, es bastante complejo. Entonces, bueno, eso sería por mi parte. Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Joanna, for that that very good overview of what's happening in Colombia and all the worrying developments over there. We will now open the floor for questions and answers, some discussion. Feel free to post questions to the speakers. We have a mix of people on this call, from civil society organizations, NGOs, activists, to perhaps others working more closely in policy or as journalists. So feel free to ask your questions. You can do so by clicking on the react button on the bottom of your screen and then raising your hand, or you can type your question also in the chat box, and then I will post them to the speakers. Just for your information, for everyone, that we can also share the presentations after this meeting, if you would like to receive those. Some people have already posted their email addresses in the chat. You can do that. Post your email address there, and then we'll make sure that you will receive the reports and the presentations afterwards. I would also like to mention that the report itself will be translated into Spanish and be made available later on, but it's currently not available yet in Spanish. So we will share that with you as well if you leave your email address in the chat. Let's open the floor for questions and answers. Feel free to raise your hand or type your question in the chat. We have a question from Vincent Valles in the chat. I think that's for Joanna. The question is, what are the 3 key messages for the Colombian government, but also for institutions in the European Union? Joanna, do you have something to say to that?
Sí, bueno, 3 mensajes claves. Ok. Principalmente diríamos que al gobierno colombiano, nosotras como organización hemos venido trabajando también, no solamente para visibilizar los conflictos socioambientales que se evidencian en Colombia frente a estos proyectos, no solamente Red Más, sino proyectos del mercado voluntario del carbono. Entonces creeríamos que uno de los puntos fundamentales es pensarnos en una moratoria que nos permita, digamos, pensarnos bien qué es lo que está pasando con este sistema, además de que ya sabemos, como lo hemos mencionado mucho, es que esto es una falsa solución. O sea, en realidad, si nosotras nos ponemos a mirar, em, el mercado de carbono voluntario se viene implementando desde el protocolo de Kioto, más o menos desde el año 1997 que se generó, ¿no? Desde el año 2005 se empezó a implementar. Entonces ya casi vamos a cumplir 30 años con la implementación de un mercado de carbono que no funciona, ¿no? ¿Por qué no funciona? Porque pues vemos que hay un aumento de la temperatura. De hecho, el año pasado ya vimos en noviembre que fracasamos como sociedad, en realidad ya ese 1,5 grados centígrados que habíamos dicho en el Acuerdo de París que no íbamos a superar, ya se superaron, ¿no? Entonces, pensaría que los mensajes claves son, por un lado, poner una moratoria a los proyectos de este tipo. También, digamos que pensarnos en soluciones reales, ¿no? Una solución efectiva que nos permita reducir las emisiones de gases de efecto invernadero y que va mucho más allá de pensarnos en un sistema económico que piensa en el crecimiento constante. Entonces sería muy importante también como poder identificar acciones de justicia climática justas, perdón, valga la redundancia, de justicia climática, que nos permitan también pues dar cuenta de si queremos dejar el petróleo en el subsuelo, ¿no? Digamos que de propuestas que sean realmente efectivas y justas con las comunidades locales. Y obviamente también esto es un tema que se traslada a la Unión Europea, porque pues es que, y no solamente a la Unión Europea, a las instituciones de la COP, o sea, a todos los países que forman parte de las COPs, y es que allí se sigue discutiendo que el mercado de carbono es la solución, ¿no? Pero el que el mercado de carbono no es la solución. Estamos viendo que el mercado de carbono está generando muchos más problemas en los territorios que se fundamentan en una compensación en donde un territorio es destruido mientras otro es conservado, ¿no? Entonces es una lógica bastante perversa y como lo mencioné, pues no permite la verdadera reducción de las emisiones de gases de efecto invernadero. Entonces pensaría que esos son mensajes clave que debemos pues mandar. Ujú.
Thanks for that answer. We have another question for Jonathan of SDI in Liberia. The question is from Samson Williams. In the absence of a structural carbon framework in Liberia, can golden petroleum go into carbon steel? Jonathan, are you able to explain a bit more about that?
Thank you. I think that this particular question should be for the policymakers. The exclusive rights to the carbon was given to Golden Beryllium. When the contract was being signed, when you contract is signed, it becomes part of the laws of Liberia. So I think when the carbon policy and law is enacted, then there will be a discussion about whether the time that they were given the exclusive carbon right, they were supposed to be given that right, and that conversation can be had. But at this particular stage, we can say something about it. It's only left to the policymakers who first give the Golden Barrel and the carbon rights. So it will be taken back to the lawmakers to fathom what can be done about it moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. We have another question in Spanish, which is about non-market-based options to fund natural protection. Jutta, are you perhaps able to answer that question? Or
From Luisa?
from Luisa, yes.
Let me quickly read, yes.
So the question in English is how could the income be generated for nature-based solutions without trampling on the rights of people and nature? How could investment in nature be generated without these market approaches?
I think there's a step back to take from that question, and that is perhaps challenging the assumption that money is always what's lacking for the protection of forests. I think there's another narrative that we have to question and look very much where it comes from and what it is motivated by, that there is always a big financing gap for so-called nature conservation. I think there is a gap of respecting the rights of those who hold, whose territories are still very intact, much more so than a gap in financing. How else? If we leave, perhaps, I think it's important to have that in mind, to not sort of kind of unquestioningly assume that there is money missing. There are situations where that's the case, but this buildup of many billion-dollar financing gap, I think has economic and political motivations much more so than anything else. Where there is a scarcity of financing, let me just mention a few possibilities where money could come from. not an increase, but a decrease in defense budgets would free up an awful lot of money, would also reduce greenhouse gas emissions that go unaccounted for in the current greenhouse gas balances. Ending fossil fuel subsidies would generate another awful lot amount of money that would also have a clear climate benefit, because it would make fossil fuel exploration and burning much more unattractive. Leveling, all of these are ideas that have been presented many, many times. Oil Change has very recently, the organization Oil Change has recently published a report with many possibilities of where money could come from. The ones I mentioned are among them. A levy on every barrel of oil that's being sold or traded internationally, another one. Taxing the super rich, there is a lot of money that can be made. So I think if honestly the issue is about the money, there are many sensible places where the money can be found. But that question of money is needed and government budgets are too low, I think is kind of a statement that closes discussion and is another way of saying I'm not interested in the conversation. I'm not saying you are that, but when I hear that kind of conversation, that's often my impression that there are sources of money, and I think for us as civil society, it's also important to highlight that perhaps money is not or lack of money is not the biggest problem. It's lack of doing something about the political and power relations that continue to destroy forest and burn the climate.
Thank you, Jutta. I see that Isaac Kana has his hand raised. Isaac, do you have a question?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks to the presenters. I have a question, mainly for Isaac Jonathan, if I get your name correctly, from the presentation from Liberia. I just learned that he talks about exclusive carbon right given to Golden Beryllium in Liberia. And then if we have in Liberia forest, let's say agricultural land is considered a non-forest land. And we are yet to define what a carbon is in terms of carbon rights, there's a carbon ownership. How is it that the government or whoever gave them that right? Is it in their agreement, in the agricultural agreement, or where can we find such right given them? Maybe can you explain on that, because we are yet to define in Liberia carbon ownership, even what is carbon. It's an ongoing discussion. There's no legal framework on that. Could you please explain a little bit how that right is given them exclusively? Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Isaac. Yes, it's in their agreement, in their contract agreement. It's in both Golden Beryllium and St. Darby's contract agreement. I think that's in rights that have been transferred to Manu will also suffice. I think the time that they signed the contract, they may not have understood, or the parliament members may not have clearly understood. I think they may have been hidden within the contract document, and that's how it got passed by the parliament. And so we've been raising awareness about it for some time now, that how can you give a right that you can't clearly define in your own national laws? Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Bud. We have a question from David Young in the chat. He asks about the ownership of the carbon, and he asks specifically for examples around the world where the carbon in the trees and the trees themselves are the property of different entities. For example, the state and communities with land titles. Perhaps, Jutta, do you know of any examples that examples of this situation. You're muted, sorry.
Sorry. Hello, David. Yes, I was looking at your question and thinking, yes, I can think of 2 or 3. And then I was thinking a bit more and wondering whether they're really separated. So I was hesitating to respond in the chat. What is definitely happening is the other way around. We heard that this morning in Malaysia, that the government recognizes only the usufruct rights of a community and claims for itself the carbon rights to their lands, and then hands out concessions, saying that those concessions do not affect the usufruct right of the community, which of course hardly ever or almost never is true, but it's exactly the reverse of what you were of what you're asking. The question that, or the example that came to my mind immediately, of examples where 2 different entities own the carbon in the tree and the trees themselves, are the contracts where you have a plantation company, timber plantation company, that continues to cut the trees on the, say, eucalyptus plantation in Uruguay or in Paraguay, so owns the trees, but has an agreement with another company that that commercializes the carbon credits and therefore owns the rights to the carbon. It's not exactly what you were asking about, but it's very similar. So I think I would tend to say, yes, there are some examples of where one entity owns the carbon and another one owns the tree. But let me think about that a little more carefully, and I will let you know if I really think that that's the case. I'm a bit hesitant to say very clearly yes.
Thank you, Jutta. Joanna, I had a question for you that I wanted to ask. We've seen in your presentations from you and Jonathan, as well as in the cases of Malaysia and Liberia, that the governments rely a lot on forestry in order to reach their nationally determined contributions. Do you know to what extent the Colombian government is relying on corresponding adjustments in relation to these carbon projects that are popping up across the country, and it is the current legal framework and the current registration framework able to facilitate that in any way?
Vale, gracias. Pues digamos que nosotras hemos hecho muchas consultas al Ministerio de Ambiente y Desarrollo Sostenible sobre esto, específicamente sobre cómo se quiere implementar el artículo 6 del Acuerdo de París, en específico, pues los artículos 6.2, 6.4 y 6.8. Infortunadamente, el gobierno nacional al día de hoy no nos ha dado respuesta. Lo único que nos dicen es que está en proceso de reglamentación, ¿no? Sin embargo, como ya digamos que se menciona también en el texto, hemos visto como que hay unos primeros pasos, ¿no? Y esos primeros pasos están en que Colombia pretende, pues, digamos, a través de este memorando de entendimiento con el gobierno de Singapur, generar como un intercambio, ¿no? Una alianza para generar, pues, después desde el artículo 6.2, como hacer ese intercambio de créditos de carbono. Pero más allá de eso, no sabemos nada. Digamos que el gobierno tiene esa información todavía muy guardada. Sabemos que hay una serie de reglamentaciones en curso. De hecho, desde el año 2023 nos vienen diciendo que hay 7 decretos pendientes por expedición, ¿no? Pendientes por ser expedidos. Ninguno de esos decretos han sido expedidos, o sea, tanto, digamos que ahí dentro de esos 7 decretos está, obviamente, la reglamentación frente al artículo 6, También todo lo que está relacionado con la resolución 1447-2018, que es la del mercado voluntario, y también lo relacionado con el Programa Nacional de Cupos Transables de Emisión. Pero el único que ha salido hasta el momento, que salió el año pasado, más o menos en octubre, fue el del Programa Nacional de Cupos Transables. Los otros no tenemos conocimiento. Entonces, eso ha sido algo bastante complejo. Poder acceder a la información, por un lado, es uno de los retos más grandes, no solamente pues de todos estos proyectos, sino del mismo gobierno nacional, que no nos ha dado información concreta sobre esto. O sea, digamos que eso es lo único que conocemos, pero pues obviamente estamos haciéndole seguimiento constantemente. Ujú.
Okay, thank you. I see. Thank you for that explanation. There was a question in the chat by Diana Yama about the restrictions to communities that are trying to implement sustainable practices. There have been some comments already in the chat.
Yes, I think maybe that's something worth underlining, that where carbon projects happen, red projects happen, the restrictions are not limited to cutting trees. The restrictions, and we have endless examples, go far beyond. Very often, those restrictions involve blocking access to the area that is declared a carbon area. In the World Rainforest Movement film No to Red, Community Voices, there is an example from a pilot carbon project in Kalimantan in Indonesia, where women weren't allowed to enter the forest even to collect medicine and other things that have no impact really on the carbon balance. We have other examples from Indonesia, from other countries too, from Brazil, where access is blocked. Similarly, in Zambia, the large Luangwa community forest projects, access is blocked and not just a taking of trees. Maybe let me add, this goes beyond the carbon market legislation. I think it's important to look at forest carbon projects not only from the carbon perspective, because if it were for carbon or climate benefits, those projects would have had to long stop, because the documentation is overwhelming that there is no benefit either for the climate or for reducing forests. So, and the document base or the evidence base of scandals and over-crediting or exaggerating the supposed climate greenhouse gas emissions, it's overwhelming. I think that debate is in a way done. I don't know what more to document, because there's a study group, an academic study group in California. They looked at forest carbon projects in the voluntary carbon market, the Berkeley Carbon project. In their press release, they said every stone they turned and under every stone they looked, they found problems. And they looked at a lot of red projects and methodologies. So I think in a way that debate is over, but still the carbon projects, the red projects, the forest carbon projects continue coming and infringing on community rights. So I think it's important to ask ourselves what else is there that's driving those projects, and that's where we come to control over territories and land, and that can continue even if the other justifications for the project are no longer justifiable, if they ever were. So I think looking at control of land helps us understand why those projects continue, and that also explains why the restrictions are not limited to activities that supposedly damage the carbon store, but go far beyond that, because it's control of land, not benefit for climate or communities.
Thank you. If anyone else has any more questions, please post them in the chat or raise your hand, and then we'll ask them. There's another question by Luisa in the chat. That I'll just quickly translate to English. The question is whether a country such as Colombia can be compelled to change its legislation on carbon markets, or whether this must come from the government itself. So I guess this relates a bit to the role of lobbying as well. Joanna, do you want to say something about this?
Sí, gracias. Pues yo creería que sí se puede, digamos que en términos de hacer una presión, ¿no? De hecho, creo que, no sé si algunos y algunas de ustedes tuvieron la oportunidad de ver que en el año 2024, este caso que les conté de las comunidades indígenas del río Piraparaná fue llevado a la CIDH, junto con otros casos en Perú, pero digamos que sí serviría, obviamente, para hacer como cierta presión. Pero creería que es, digamos que, o sea, que la Comisión Interamericana de Derechos Humanos no tiene esa facultad, ¿no? Legal de obligar directamente al país a cambiar la legislación sobre el mercado de carbono, pero sí, digamos que se puede generar como una presión, unas recomendaciones que como pues como en el caso del Piraparaná escaló a esa instancia, y pues como ya les comenté también se emitió una sentencia, pero más allá de eso no creo que la Corte pueda pues hacer algo adicional. Ajá.
Thanks for that explanation. Unless there's any other question from the audience, then I will pose the last question to Jonathan to wrap this meeting up. Jonathan, my question for you is how forest-dependent communities can best resist these developments in Liberia. Do you have any good examples of that, or any key messages that you would like to share? If so, please do.
Thank you. We do work with communities a lot. So part of what we do is provide them education, especially free prior informed consent, so that whenever an investor or a company goes to their community, they are able to apply the free prior informed consent tool. One community that I can think about is when this carbon thing started to happen, when many carbon investors were going into communities. One of the communities we've worked with, because Yalu in Riverside County, received a draft contract from one of the companies, and the community shared that contract with us. And what the law, the Land Rights Act of 2018, require is that the communities should first self-identify before they can engage with any company. And so when we advise them, they said, we can engage with you until we can be organized. And the company wanted to first sign a contract, then do a feasibility study later. And so usually we always have the communities that are very much informed and alert, backed by the Land Rights Act that was passed in 2018. Even the blue carbon contract that should have gone through, it was a similar thing that we did again. We provided awareness, even though we did campaign and advocacy and issue press statement and press releases. But the actual game changer were the communities that resisted these contracts happening. Yeah. So that's the experience that we have. The communities are more alert in Liberia. Thank you.
Thanks for sharing that. Thanks. I think we'll leave it at that. It's 6:30 on my end. We'll wrap this up. I just want to stress that the report is available if you want to have a more detailed look at these cases. You can find it on the through the link that I posted in the chat. So a Spanish translation will be available soon, and we will share that as well. If you would like to receive the presentations and the report by email, please leave your email address in the chat, and then we'll share those with you. For now, I would like to thank our speakers, Jutta Keel, Joanna Peña, and Jonathan Jha, for their very excellent presentations and insights. And thank you all for participating. I wish you all a very pleasant evening or rest of your day, wherever you are. Thank you and bye-bye. Maybe see you later.
Thank you and bye-bye. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Muchas gracias a todos, todas. Feliz día.